Welcome to our weekly mini session. Each week we will deliver a bite-sized workshop on hot topics. This workshop will be live on our main Facebook page as well as our certified teachers group. We will also have it recorded so you can reference all of our previous topics on the AcroDance Resource Center. Be sure to let us know where you're from in the comments below. Today's topic is why is shoulder and hip flexibility important for bridge work? We have special guest teacher Kate Evans with us. Kate is a course conductor and examiner for both acrobatic arts and aerial arts. She is a registered RAD ballet teacher and dance, jazz, contemporary, tap, and ballet teacher, and has over 20 years teaching experience and running her own dance studio with acro, dance, and aerial arts. She holds a Bachelor of Psychology and is a course conductor for Elixir Flexibility. Kate has a passion for the biomechanics of dance, acro, aerial, and endorsing safe and progressive dance, acro, and aerial training. Welcome, Kate. Take it away. So nice to have you.
Hi guys, I'm super excited to be here today to have a chat about why shoulder and hip flexibility is important. So basically, in a very simple way, the answer is to achieve any progression in skills from a bridge, we require an inline bridge. To create an inline bridge requires hip and shoulder flexibility. Simple, you might think. So how do we improve hip and shoulder flexibility? Simple in theory, but as we all know, even the static human body is a complex structure. Add in a little bit of dynamic motion, and this is where we're all brought back right into the here and now in the studio. Often I see teachers in studios very stuck when it comes to progressing hip and shoulder flexibility. I am sure I'm not alone when I can say that we've all experienced that student that just cannot kick over in a bridge. The frustrations run high, the backs get sorer and sorer, and it seems that no amount of stretching works. We know they're lacking hip and shoulder flexibility. We're doing all the stretches, but nothing is changing. When I teach my students, I explain it to them like a 1,000-piece puzzle. To create a beautiful line and functional bridge, we need all the pieces of the puzzle to come together to form hip and shoulder flexibility. To access hip and shoulder flexibility, we need to find that center piece of the puzzle, and that centerpiece is core stabilization. The hip and the shoulder joint are both ball and socket joints. And what this means is that we have movements available in 6 different directions. We have flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal and external rotation, plus circumduction in the shoulder joint. This allows a larger range of motion available to these joints. However, the catch, if the joints are not aligned, the flexibility cannot be accessed. To access flexibility in these 2 areas, we need strong control and alignment with a really great core stabilization. These deep core muscles stabilize and protect the spine and pelvis, along with the erector spinae, internal and external obliques, and the rectus abdominis. They provide mobility to the trunk and connect the pelvis with the spine and the thoracic cavity. In really simple terms, core stability is the process of holding the shoulder and pelvic girdles, that is the center part or the core of the body, stable in order to support the movement forces from the arms and the legs. To do this, the muscles that are responsible for stabilizing must function correctly so that the muscles responsible for the movement in the arms and the legs can perform their job correctly. Simply put, postural alignment held by core stabilization directly affects hip and shoulder flexibility. And this takes us back to the puzzle analogy. So here are some examples of misalignment. On the screen, you can see misalignment with the shoulder joint. If we sit in a chair with our arms overhead and slumped posture, we have very limited range of motion in the shoulder joint. To move the arms into full flexion above the head requires the thoracic spine to move into extension. During flexion, the scapula upwardly rotates and posteriorly tilts on the rib cage, which encourages thoracic extension. Therefore, in this instance, if the thoracic spine cannot extend, then the scapula can't tilt and the shoulder joint cannot get to full flexion. And this decreases the flexibility in the shoulders and also increases the risk for shoulder injury. In this image on your screen, you'll see the correct postural alignment where the student is able to access shoulder flexibility in a neutral postural alignment. To be able to improve shoulder flexibility, we need the thoracic spine to have mobility as well as flexibility and extension in order to extend right through the armpits and allow full flexion of the shoulder. Some examples of misalignment in the pelvis. In the first video, we see misalignment within the hip. When we stand with our core out, we see the pelvis is aligned with an anterior or forward tilt. What this means is the front of the pelvis tips down and the back of the pelvis lifts up. In this position, it's a flexed position and the hip flexors and quads are activated and shortened. In the second video, we see the same anterior tilt with the leg in extension. In this position, what happens is the lack of ability to access the range of motion from the front of the hip dumps into the middle lower back. To work on hip extension, we really want to prevent that from happening. In the third image, we see the opposite effect. In this image, we see a posterior tilt. In that, the pelvis is tucked, so the student possibly was cued to drive through the hips. When driving through the hips, we're getting the back of the pelvis dipping down and the front of the pelvis pulling up. And this is causing, again, the hip flexion to contract and the range of motion to shorten, and then it's going to dump into the middle lower back. So this brings us to how we cue our students. How do we translate all of that information into the classroom in a way that the students can understand? I often like to use visions and different words because they will help different students to understand what we want them to achieve. Some really great cueing drills are lengthen the pearls of the spine. When we're looking at the anterior tip of the pelvis, what we can say is imagine holding a ball of water level and be careful not to tip any out. A great way to activate core stabilization is to say to zip up your core. When we're looking at squaring and we want them to melt through from the back hip, I often say, especially to my littles, let your back hip be the winner, or melt from the hip. A really great way to lift up again and correct an anterior tilt is to say, put your joey in your pouch and button it into your belly button. When I see students with their ribs flaring, I say, put your life jacket on and pull down the tabs of your ribs to activate. So these words help the students to activate in the right place and try to find the correct muscle that we want them to think about. When I teach my students in the classroom, I always use lots of different drills. The drills help the student to focus on one little thing and visualize what they want their body to do. In the first video, we have a student learning to access the front of the hip and take the hip into extension. This teaches postural activation in a neutral alignment. It's also carried through from classical training. In the first video, you can see the students activating the core whilst lifting up and finding the extension in the front of the hip. We're encouraging the pelvis to remain neutral and the ribs to be pulling down on their tabs. A really important cue is to say relax the shoulders into the floor and lengthen the pearls of the spine whilst keeping the core activated. This also helps the students to activate and lengthen the hamstrings to give support and strength, which is going to form into the bridge later. In the next video, we have an example of activation and flexion through the front of the arms whilst in a neutral posture. This is teaching the student how to raise their arms above their head whilst maintaining a neutral alignment throughout the core and the pelvis. Once the students have established that very simple range of alignment and postural control, we can add a little bit of mobility into the skill. In this first video, we're doing shrugs, and the shrugs are providing stability as well as mobility in the shoulder joint. You can see the student is focusing on pulling the ribs down and trying to maintain a nice neutral pelvis. As she raises her arms up into full flexion, it's more difficult for her to control her ribs, but this is getting her ready to turn it upside down and put more weight on her hands in a bridge that will come. In the next video, we're looking at squaring, and this is where the concept of squaring begins, by teaching the students mobility of the hips. In the first skill, the student is hitching and then lowering, and then we are training the student to lift her hip eyes up and then return back to neutral. The next part of the drill is to take the hip eyes down to the floor and then return to neutral. And what this does is teaches them the tilt of the pelvis. Finally, we finish with squaring, encouraging the student to come and melt through the back hip. Once they have an understanding of this squaring, we can take it into a more complex movement as they've got that core activation and postural control. Now we're going to move into stretching for progression and finding the flexibility in the hips and the shoulders whilst holding postural alignment. In the image on your screen, you can see the student is in a square split. The student's maintaining really great postural alignment here and really working to come from the back hip. Although she's sitting higher in the split, she's really accessing her flexibility from the front of the hip joint. In the next image, we see a student who's arching in her lower back. Her hips are not square or level, and the core is not activated. In this position, the student's trying to get flexibility, and it's all coming from her lumbar spine. In the next position, this is a tricky one. Even though the student looks like she's square and her hips are level, we call this a false square, as the student is not getting flexibility from the front of the hip. So when this drill is taken and put into a bridge, she's not going to have gained the progression in the flexibility from doing this skill. In this drill, it teaches the student to work the hips forward even further into hyperextension. By keeping the hip headlights looking straight and engaging the core and pulling down on those rib tabs, we can encourage the student to melt forward and drive from the hip. In this position, once she gets to her full extent of progression, encourage the student to add in a little bit of mobility to help to work the hip joint and aid her to gain further progression. As she furthers deeper into the stretch, she really needs to concentrate on pulling the ribs, and adding a hollow can help to protect the lumbar spine. Once there, to deepen the stretch into the quadriceps, we can ask the student to raise the back foot. What this does is connects the quadricep with the hip in extension, and it's a much more similar position to what's going to come in the bridge. Moving into the shoulders now. One of my favorite stretches to encourage opening through the front of the arms and the upper back and thoracic is the moose stretch. In the moose stretch, we need to be very cautious to ensure they're holding their core. Remember back to those first drills we did, where that core stabilization is really, really important, so the alignment of the shoulders is correct. Always aim to do the moose stretch with the head up as well as down, so we're working into the cervical vertebrae, and this will aid the head to connect with the fingers when the student attempts the bridge. This is an example of a moose stretch done without any core or postural alignment. As you can see, all of the stretch is being taken in the lumbar spine, so this stretch becomes ineffective, and she is no longer opening up through her upper back and thoracic. Once we have the student able to contain their postural alignment as well as mobility, we can then move them into translating this alignment and newfound flexibility into a more dynamic movement. This is a really great drill to teach that. Starting off with a really basic hip lift so the student's body is receptive and ready to push into a full bridge, cue the student to activate their core and open up through the front of the hip. In this position, the feet are raised on a stack. Raising the feet on a stack neutralizes out the lumbar spine and helps the student to find that really good alignment in the full bridge. Once open through the hips, we cue the student to push up into a bridge and try to progress through his armpits and upper back and shoulders. Gentle rocking and progression in this position will encourage him to come from the armpits. And then lowering down with core activation is reverse training of stabilizing the core. Another really great drill for training the entire package with the postural alignment and newfound flexibility is a kneeling half bridge up against a wall. In this position, cue the students to gently lift their fingers off the wall and slowly work through their armpits and cervical vertebrae and into their upper back. A very small movement to begin with, and then return back to the wall, engaging their core. In this position, the hip is in extension and the core is held with the pelvis neutral. Once they've found that little progression, they can try for even further progression of moving even further down to possibly getting their hands in line with their hips. Always keeping an eye that their hips are staying close to the wall, the pelvis is neutral, and the core is well activated. And finally, we look at putting the hips and the shoulders together. This is the hardest of all the drills for the students because they have to connect hip flexibility with shoulder flexibility at the same time. And this is often when we see them start to dump in the middle lower back. This drill uses active flexibility by asking the student to move through the positions whilst maintaining a really great alignment through the core and opening through the hip. Alignment of the back leg and front leg are really, really important here. Cue the student to lift up through the core and think about melting through the hip as they start a small progression in their upper back and shoulders. From here, they lengthen up and forwards whilst maintaining their nice parallel alignment. Next, they move into an even bigger progression. Keep cueing them to come from the hip and lifting from the core. From there, ask the student to place their hands down on the floor and work a little bit of mobility into the stretch. This will help them to get further into their square and come even better from the front of their hip. From here, we're going to ask the student to reach back up, stabilize on the mat with her core, and then work to bend the back leg and work through the upper back to create a C curve, similar to what we'll find when we translate this into our bridge. In this position, the student can then take an arm up to join in with the upper back and shoulder flexibility and possibly reach the back foot. Once she reaches the back foot, it's really, really important to cue the student to lift up and support again with her core, re-square, and come from the hip. Getting the two together is extremely difficult, but this is a really great training tool to do that. Now we're going to have a look at the same drill done incorrectly. Remember how I talked about the concept of a false square? So in this position, the student looks like she's much more flexible and she's much lower in the drill. But as we can see, she's actually using her lumbar spine to get that range of motion. Her hips are looking down to the floor, so she's not actually accessing the flexibility from the front of the hip to do this drill. And it's very pronounced here once she connects the shoulders with the hips. Now let's take a look at how hip and shoulder flexibility affects the bridge progressions. In the first video, we have a bridge kickover. The student is really struggling to kick over. Her bridge is far too long. She's really lacking flexibility in the upper back and shoulders. And you can see she has no cervical flexibility with her eyes looking straight. Her hips are sinking and they're not lifting, and she's not coming through the front of the hips. This is causing misalignment down to the knee and into the feet. Now let's take a look at a good one. In this position, you can see the student has her shoulders well past her hands, and she's able to access that lovely range of motion through the shoulders and the hips. This is why hip and shoulder flexibility is so important to bridging. Following on from the bridge kickover, we see a walkover. In the first video, we see the student lacking shoulder flexibility, hip flexibility, and shoulder alignment, but she has good strength in her skill. In the second video, we see the student has the flexibility, but is lacking that core strength and stabilization, which is causing her not to be able to access the hip and shoulder flexibility correctly. Now let's look at a good one. Lovely strength, great stability, and the wrists are well over the shoulders, enabling the progression into the back walkover. Now, think about your tumbling passes. When they're in the middle of a tumbling pass and they're flying so quickly down the mat, they need to be able to understand how to come from the hip quickly, especially in a back layout. This student is able to open through her hips and access the range of motion from the front of her hips to initiate the correct movement required for a back layout. Now let's take a look at a different range of bridges. In this bridge, we see the core relaxed. The student is unable to access the flexibility from the front of the hip, and we can see slight flexion and contraction through those hip flexors. This shortening of the hip flexors is causing a pull on the quadricep, and she's unable to lengthen the quad, causing all the dumping in the middle lower back. We can also see that there's piking in the shoulders and also a slight winging. And this misalignment is due to the fact that she's unable to stabilize through her core. Now we see a bridge that has sufficient strength and stability, but is lacking in hip and shoulder flexibility. In this bridge, we see the student piking in the armpits with the knees turning out slightly and the feet that aren't parallel. This can be caused due to the tightness in the quad and the IT band preventing the parallel alignment. She's also lacking the hip flexibility. She has great core stabilization and strength, but because she's lacking that flexibility, she's unable to get the bridge in line. This bridge would be difficult to progress over to a bridge kickover because the shoulders aren't in line with the wrists. Now we see a nice bridge. In this bridge, we see the student with sufficient upper back and shoulder flexibility, as well as an adequate opening through the front of the hip. When looking at a bridge, we're really looking for 50% flexibility to come from the shoulders and upper back and 50% flexibility to come from the hips. The student is really working to stabilize the core to ensure the lumbar spine is neutralized and there's no dumping through there. And we can see that through that plateauing out through the middle lower back. The student's really trying to lead through with the armpits. And if we drew a drop line down from here, we can see her bridge is well past the wrists. She's working to elongate her spine, and she has her shoulders pressed up to her ears to be able to access the flexibility through the upper back and shoulders. The opening through the front of her hips and flexibility through her hips is allowing her feet to be in parallel, so her hips, knees, and feet are all tracking in alignment. A bridge with core stabilization alongside hip and shoulder flexibility is the bridge that we're really looking for. When forming a bridge, as I mentioned, we're really looking to get 50% of the flexibility from the upper back and shoulders and 50% of flexibility from the hips. To achieve this, we need to ensure good alignment, balanced strength, stability, and mobility exist together. Remember to always strive for progression over perfection and celebrate the small gains in your student's journey. Remember, every student is unique and their journey will reflect this, but they all have the capability to progress. Okay, Marie, I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you so much for having me today.
Oh, of course. It's our pleasure to have you and to be able to share all of this. That was really excellent. So thank you so much, Kate. And thank you, teachers, for joining us for this weekly mini. You can learn more about acrobatic arts and our programs at acrobaticarts.com. Be sure to join us next week for our session on next pieces of equipment to buy, what you can do with them, and why you'll love them, with special guest acrobatic arts examiner and course conductor, Sarah Reese. See you then. Thank you, everybody.